Has expired. Mr. Goldman is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Here we are again, yet another hearing, our third one in the Oversight Committee on the 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia, which represents 0.002 of the total American population. Now, the subtitle of this hearing is The Path to Election Integrity in D.C. Election integrity, a term that we hear all the time from our Republican friends. And it's a term that is used all the time around the country to justify voter restriction laws in numerous states with Republican legislatures. Ms. Weiser, since 2020, how many states have passed laws to restrict voter access?
Thank you very much for your question. Last year, before the election, there were 20 states that had passed 33 new laws restricting access to the vote. This year, I believe I will send you the, we are about to put out new numbers of how many have passed.
What is the general justification for these voter restriction laws?
Virtually all of these are justified under the purported need to stop voter fraud, many of them using the same disinformation about election denialism and the 2020 election.
So let's talk about voter fraud. Ms. Evans, how many cases of voter fraud have ever been proved in the history of Washington, D.C.?
I don't have statistics as far as the history of D.C., but as far as
Are you aware of any?
There have been cases that have been brought to our attention of suspected voter fraud. As far as proven voter fraud, I have no information. However, based on what has been brought to my attention, the numbers are less than 1%.
Well, let me just tell you that according to the Heritage Foundation, the answer is 0.
Yes.
And you are correct that the percentage of voter fraud on across the country is infinitesimal. But let's talk a little bit more about voter fraud. Mr. Spies, do you know what the last congressional, which congressional election was last had to be redone because of widespread voter fraud? Do you know where that was?
Indiana?
No.
I assume?
Well, maybe, but are you aware of North Carolina 9 in 2018?
Yes, and I'm also aware of Louisiana, Indiana, North Carolina.
Right. Well, in North Carolina 9, as I'm sure you know, there was a massive voter fraud scheme perpetrated by Republicans. And so what we have here is essentially a circular vacuum where Republicans are talking about voter fraud that doesn't exist, and when it exists, it's perpetrated by Republicans, to justify voter restriction laws passed by Republican legislatures based on phantom and false information about voter fraud. That is ultimately the problem that we have here. And really, it is, as Ms. Weiser said, complete disinformation. Voter fraud is not a thing. It's not a thing that affects elections. Mr. Cuccinelli, let's talk about the 2020 election, which I know you worked in the Trump administration as in a senior level, Department of Homeland Security. What is CISA?
CISA is one of the 8 agencies of the Department of Homeland Security.
And it
Been so since 2018.
And it oversees our election security, correct?
No, that's not accurate. The states oversee that. CISA networks the states together to stay in touch with one another about threats to their elections.
Okay, I'm not sure the difference, but you are aware that the head of CISA in 2020, who worked in the same Department of Homeland Security as you did, stated that the 2020 election was the most secure in our history. Are you not?
I'm familiar with the quote to which you were referencing.
Right.
Yes.
And do you have any basis, factual basis, to disagree with that assessment from the head of our election security agency in the Department of Homeland Security?
So that is not an election security agency, and he had no factual basis to make the statement. That is the province of the states.
Interesting.
The gentleman-
All right. I'm glad we have that on the record.
The
I
gentleman's
yield back.
time